Okay, well, let us go ahead and get started. So today, Dr. Jackson's going to talk to us about a passion of his, and that is ethical business practices. And Dr. Jackson is our medical director over our business development, consultative services group, our support services group, and our IT resources. So through Dr. Jackson's experience with information technology and his medical background as a physician, we've developed some pretty comprehensive and client useful tools, one of which is ARUP Consult. It's a clinical decision support tool that was developed through Brian's team. And it's a tool that's publicly available to clients. It's not an exclusive tool. You can get to it through the website, and it's available to anybody to use for clinical decision support and helping educate physicians about appropriate test utilization. So Brian has been with ARUP for quite a while, and he is going to come and talk to us today about his passion, as it says, getting back to the roots and ethical business practice. So with that, Brian, please, I'll leave it up to you.
So within the healthcare industry, there are, in some sense, two different groups of actors. Healthcare is a huge industry, but you've got two different groups who seem to play by different sets of rules, and it creates some problems. So on one hand, you have the frontline workers, so folks like all of you here in the audience who are heavily indoctrinated in the Hippocratic Oath tradition and scientific ethics and so forth. People like Catherine Gibson here. So Dr. Gibson is the medical director of the family clinic at ARUP. I can tell you from personal experience, she prioritizes patient welfare over anything else, above her own interests, above any other interests, and you would never get her to behave differently. On the other hand, within the healthcare industry broadly, there are a lot of large corporations. There are a lot of large for-profit corporations producing everything from drugs to devices to health insurance to running hospitals. And sometimes it seems as if these organizations, particularly certain of these organizations, prioritize money over patients. No one will admit to doing this, but we all know this goes on. So a couple easy targets would be to talk about the opioid epidemic. If any of you have gone to YouTube, for example, and search on INSYS, you can find some really fascinating videos of salespeople dancing and singing about how they were pushing opiates in ways that were not necessarily good for patients. It's actually quite horrendous. That company, by the way, no longer exists. It's bankrupt, and their leadership are now serving time in federal prison, which is quite remarkable. On the left, we have another pharmaceutical company owned by a famous philanthropy family, the Sacklers, and you've got museums, art museums around the world that are refusing to take millions of dollars in donations because they recognize where the money came from. It's dirty money. Pharmaceutical industry, it's a really easy one to pick on, but we know that whether we're talking about devices, whether we're talking about health insurers, whether we're talking about large hospital chains, or whether we're talking about companies within the diagnostic space. Many of you will recognize a player right here who gave a talk here at ACC a few years ago and actually went pretty far toward producing an unethical company before it got shut down. So this is a broad problem across all sectors of healthcare. Now, is this inevitable? I think particularly in the United States, we just take this for granted. We've somehow become defeatist or sort of accepted the idea that when you have a for-profit corporation, that their only real obligation is to make profits for shareholders. I'm here to tell you that's not necessarily true, and it's not inevitable. So what I want to talk just a few minutes, very briefly, is sort of 101, quick, fast introduction to stakeholder capitalism in the healthcare space. So imagine a hospital. Some of you work for hospitals, I'm guessing, or for health systems. Most hospitals in the United States are heavily mission-driven, not-for-profit, patient-centered organizations, and that's great. And most hospitals have leadership that drives that culture down and you have great ethical behavior when you're facing inward toward the workforce and the departments within a hospital or health system, if it's run well, which most are. But what about the outward relationships? What about the relationships that hospitals have to pharmaceutical companies and distributors, to physician groups, some of whom are private, to health insurance companies, to commercial laboratories, and obviously the relationships to the patients themselves? Can those relationships be leveraged? Can those business relationships be used in ways to reinforce ethical accountability? The answer is absolutely. Most hospitals just haven't set this up yet because they're used to doing things in ways that are just all about getting low prices. So how does this actually work in practice? So I'm going to give 3 quick examples, purely for illustration. So don't take these too far, but basically what I'm talking about is 3 different types of business relationships and how they can be leveraged for ethical leverage or ethical influence. The first one, some of you may have seen these headlines a few months ago, but it's an example of an employee-employer relationship. Now, we don't usually think of employees of an organization as having an awful lot of power in the relationship, but when employees band together around a cause, they can actually have a lot of influence. This was an example of a furniture company, Wayfair, that was found to be selling furniture to the federal government for immigrant detention centers down in Texas. Regardless of how you feel about that particular issue, I'll tell you, a lot of Wayfair employees didn't like that their employer was selling furniture for those purposes, and they went on strike. This is an unusual story. You don't usually hear about employees going on strike unless it's for better pay or better benefits. That's not why they were striking. They were striking because they didn't like the ethical behavior, as they interpreted it, of their employer. So this is a form of leverage through a business relationship. Second example, back to the pharmaceutical industry, and I find this one interesting in a different way. Astellas is a Japanese pharmaceutical company. They produce tacrolimus. Some of you in your laboratories may test tacrolimus, so you're familiar with this one. Astellas is also part of the ABPI, the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry. ABPI is a trade group. It's just like PHRMA in the US. You think of these trade organizations as mainly lobbying groups to protect the interests of their members, and they certainly do a lot of that. But a year or 2 ago, when Astellas got caught breaking the law, specifically Astellas sent a whole bunch of European doctors to this luxury resort in Italy for sales messages about off-label uses of some of their drugs, uses that were not approved in advance by the European pharma regulators. Astellas got the usual slap on the wrist from the regulators, but what's interesting to me was that their trade association actually kicked them out for a couple years. This is interesting. This is unusual. Trade associations usually protect their members, but this was a case of leveraging the member trade association business relationship in a way to reinforce ethical expectations. So I found this actually quite remarkable. The third example, and I love using this one because this is Walmart, and no one ever thinks of Walmart when they want to think of, a paragon of ethical behavior. But this is an example where Walmart did the right thing, and that's why I like to use the example. So a number of years ago, I think it was 2012, there was a seafood supplier down in New Orleans named CJ's. It was one of the major seafood suppliers for the southern region of Walmart. And CJ's got caught breaking the law in a particular way. They were hiring undocumented workers, subjecting them to unsafe working conditions, cheating them out of their pay. It's an old game that companies can use to, basically under threat of deportation, you exploit the workers. So they were violating all kinds of federal laws, and they got shut down by the feds. So the immigration authorities came in, shut them down, did a raid. But what happened next was within a day of this hitting the news, Walmart issued a press release. And Walmart said, "We are shocked, we are horrified, we are firing our supplier." They were not a subsidiary of Walmart. Walmart was not the one that broke the law. But Walmart was smart enough to know that they could not afford, for purposes of their customers, for purposes of their workforce, they could not afford to be associated with human rights violations. And they were smart enough to distance themselves from this. So this is it's a retailer to supplier relationship. So lots of different kinds of relationships where you can have influence on another entity that's not even you. To make this work, there's one more piece of the puzzle that I just want to acknowledge, and it all has to do with transparency and sunshine. When we're talking about ethics, if companies are allowed to hide behavior, to say they're doing the right thing, but actually do something else behind the scenes, none of this accountability work really works very well. So to have an effective marketplace where companies are rewarded for good behavior, you have to have effective, auditable transparency around ethical behaviors. So it turns out that there's a group working on this. They've actually become quite popular on Wall Street, called the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. What they've done is they've taken financial accounting as their model. So in financial accounting, if you want to invest in a company, you need transparent reporting of that company's financials. So pick any of the big for-profit companies exhibiting here. You could go to their website today, you could download their annual report, and you could see their revenue and their profits and their cash flow and all of the numbers that you might want to see as an investor. What SASB is doing is applying the same basic principles around sustainability criteria, essentially around ethical behavior criteria. So if you follow the SASB model, if you follow their standards, you're going to report on how many OSHA violations you had last year, because that relates to worker safety. You're going to report on, if you're a hospital system, you're going to report on how much charity care you did. You're going to report on how many FDA violations you had and how much money you had to pay in fines, those sorts of things. So in conclusion, we all know this, but we sometimes, it's still worth reinforcing in an audience like this. Healthcare is not like just any other industry. We are not in a consumer products industry. We are not in entertainment. If you want entertainment, you can go across the street to Disney. It's a great company, but it's not healthcare. Our society expects much higher levels of ethical performance from the healthcare industry. And it's not just what's expected of individual doctors and healthcare workers and lab techs and nurses and pharmacists and everyone else. It's what's expected of the entire industry, which means that large corporations need to follow, to be brought into the same ethical realm as everyone else. We haven't always had this. I think our country's struggling a little bit in this area. And my hope is that with enough creative people, like people here in this area, who care about this topic, but also can use their creativity to come up with new ways to leverage business relationships to apply accountability outward, that maybe we can have an impact on our industry overall. So with that, thank you very much for hanging out and listening to my pitch. And I would be happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions.
So Brian, some of the questions that have been posed to us when you've given this talk with clients or when we have these conversations is that it sounds great and it sounds like 1960s VW,
yes,
warm, fuzzy type
it's
stuff.
very hippie.
Is it realistic in our highly competitive healthcare environment, this
Yes.
concept?
So the risk in my talking about this topic is it doesn't sound like real business. It sounds like some sort of socialist paradise kind of a set of ideas. But I'm telling you, everything that I've talked about today comes out of publications like Harvard Business Review. It's coming out of the hedge fund industry. It's the business community that's figuring out how capitalism is sort of broken right now and ways to fix it in ways that the markets actually function better. So every bit of this, when I talk about stakeholder capitalism, the second word in that phrase is for real. This is real capitalism. You go back to Adam Smith, for example, sort of the father of capitalist theory in England in the 1700s. Adam Smith talks about well-functioning markets where people don't get exploited, but that profits are sort of fair and transparent, and everything works as expected in society. So it's not fantasy. This is actually doable. I think American business culture has just gotten a bit off track in the last couple of decades.
So given with that idea, one of the questions that was posed earlier was, What does ARUP do to practice these ethically sustainable behaviors, and how are they employing these type of things in their business model and their interactions with hospitals as we try to help them solve problems?
So Corinne, can you hold up the gray magnify?
Oh, the magnified term.
Yeah. So anyone that's sort of interested in ARUP's approach to this, I could go on and on, but the fastest thing to do would just be pick up a copy of that. The lead article is all about this topic. So one of the things that it talks about is the internal code of ethics that we have and that we expect of our employees, that we call the 5 pillars. I think a lot of your organizations probably have similar codes of ethics. So I refer you to that rather than brag about our organization.
Is there an example in the industry that really sticks out in your mind of an organization or somebody that's actually doing ethical practice that just really jumps out at you as somebody that we could emulate or explore?
If I name a name, then everyone else will be left out. So I got to be a little bit careful here. But I will tell you that
someone that appears to be a little more apparent about it.
Well, I will give you an example of something that I'd love to see others emulate. So one remarkable feature of the U.S. healthcare space is that the hospital and health system sector is predominantly run by extremely dedicated, mission-driven organizations and leadership. The fact that most hospitals were founded as religious entities, it tells you something about the motivation behind the whole hospital industry in the beginning. So there's a lot of leadership that I see going on in the hospital and health system space. One specific thing that I'd love to just call out and have people think about as a really good example is Dignity Health in California has in addition to their annual report of sort of operational financial performance, they have an annual sustainability report where they talk about all of their sort of social sustainability actions and the metrics behind them and so forth. I would love to see every for-profit healthcare company in the country have a sustainability report.